thing that I hope for is that news organizations take a broader view of what their mission is, and that they're here to try and serve the public, not to try and keep writing stories that they would like to write or preserve just what we do, but more think about it from the sort of the broad mission point of view, because I think there's both threat and there's real opportunity for us to do a better job.
Hi, welcome to the Media Copilot. It's a podcast that dives into how AI is changing media, news, and communication. I'm your host, Pete Pachal. I covered tech for a long time as a journalist, and now I have deep discussions with the media players, the builders, and the creators who are answering the question, how will we get information in the future? And how will that change the practice of news gathering and the business of media? This week, I'm talking to Gina Chua, Executive Editor at Large for Semafor, where she leads AI strategy. Gina is one of those rare newsroom leaders who's been deep in the day-to-day realities of modern journalism and also close to the product and technology that now shapes modern journalism. Before Semafor, Gina was executive editor at Reuters, overseeing editorial operations and newsroom safety, working with technology teams on tools that both support reporting and also scale. She also serves as executive director of the Tonite Center, where her work sits right at the intersection of journalism and AI. So this conversation is about the practical questions that come after the headlines. What does AI strategy mean when you're responsible for both a news product and a newsroom? Well, let's find out. Gina, welcome to the Media Copilot.
Thanks for having me.
Cool. Yeah, it's my pleasure. When you obviously the leading AI strategy is a great thing to be doing these days. But what does that mean exactly for Semafor? Like, what does it include?
It's a great thing, or sometimes it's a terrifying thing, right? I mean, there's things change all the time, and you can think through it. So every news organization has different strategies. Semafor's got a very particular lane that we play in. I think we play in it really well, and so our strategy isn't the same that would that might apply to another organization. But a lot of what we're doing at Semafor is really kind of, at least in the newsroom, right, leaving aside the sort of the other business functions, is to see how we can use it to help gain efficiencies, obviously, but also how to extend the reach of a relatively small, but I will say highly talented team. How do we extend our reach? How do we make ourselves be able to do more? So let me give you a couple of examples. We have all the obvious tools that we've built ourselves: copy editing, proofreading. We have tools that will help us build charts, but not just a chart building tool. It's a tool that will read your story and then suggest what data might work, and it knows what data we have access to. And then, having done that, it will then say to you, look, these are 5 possible data sets that could illustrate your story. Would you like to go to the sites of these data sources? Would you like us to download you the data we think that will fit, or would you like us to build it in our style via data wrapper? And you can choose any one of those. It will still give you that. You obviously need to check it, but the idea that it's read your story, so you don't have to sort of sit and think so much about it. We have a tool that will read your story, and if we're looking for related stories, which we often put at the end of a story, which is something we call notables, and other stories on the same topic, it'll read your story and it will automatically go out and search. And if we wanted to, we can tell it to go out and search in specific languages. So let's say we're doing a story about investment in China. We could say, yes, but while you're doing that, search for stories in Chinese. Okay. Translate them. Give us a snippet. Obviously, we're not taking the AI's word for it, but translate it and gives us a sense of what we can kind of look out for. And those are just the efficiency tool. We have tools that I tend to call either sort of scaling tools or conceptual tools. I've got sort of a hierarchy in my head about what tools do.
So you got a lot of different tools, obviously, and you've focused on a couple that are helping with your reporting process. I remember reading early on, I think you were one of the brands that was out pretty early with Semafor Signals. That got a lot of press at the time. I actually wrote about it a little bit. Is this, the second tool, I think you call it Notables, is that what signals grew into? Is signals a different thing?
No,
Whatever happened with
it's
signals?
functionally what happened. I mean, the core idea of signals was there is an event, and what you want to know is you want to get not necessarily what happened, because obviously that's a core part of it, but we can do that. And in any case, there's a lot of places you can find out what just happened. What we wanted to do with signals was to show you the smart perspectives on it very quickly. If the Guardian had a smart perspective, if the Times of India had a smart perspective, if the Globe and Mail had a smart perspective, we wanted to be able to pull that together very quickly. And what does that require, right? Because we weren't using AI to write that. What we were doing is we needed a system that could search for all of these things very quickly across a multiplicity of sites that you could constrain or open up widely. And so that core functionality is the thing I've described to you for Notables. It functionally does the same thing. Now we've turned the output into Notables in our stories.
Oh, I got you. Okay, and that's AI generated and then journalist vetted.
It's not AI generated. It's AI enabled, right?
Got
So
it.
we don't take the summaries that the AI system writes. The summaries are functionally the way of just telling us, here are 15 things that it's found. Which 3 would are the ones you should read? And it summarizes them so you understand, like, I should spend my time on these 3 or 5 links rather than on these other 7 links.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically it's a functional equivalent of a book report, right? There are 15 books you could read. Here's what each of the books say. I only have time to read 5 of them. Which 5 should I read? I'm not counting on the summary to be entirely accurate, but it's giving me a good sense of which ones I should spend my time on.
Nice. That's really cool. How much does the newsroom or I guess the experimentation and the communication with them, how much input do they have on the tools? Do you get a lot of like ideas and requests from that side of things in terms of like what they kind of want to do with AI? I guess like starting there, and then I have other questions about like just the newsroom attitude around AI in general, because that's always
we have a really small newsroom, and we have a very
What's about the size of it?
We're just south of 40 in the newsroom
decent,
right now.
Yeah, getting there.
And it's eager and forward thinking, and so basically everybody's embraced the tools. The tools are functionally built by a couple of people in the newsroom. One person in particular who does it in his spare time. I used to do some of that myself. I've sort of eased off that. Now somebody else is chipping in to build. So these are nearly entirely in-house built tools, and we're vibe coding our way through it, and and having quite a lot of success. So in terms of your question, are people asking for things? Yes, they absolutely are asking for things because they want more capabilities. So another relatively simple tool we've built is, so we do a lot of interviews, and we're a very events forward business. And so we've got, we've done a ton of CEO interviews, we've done a ton of panel discussions, and we have those transcripts, right? And so obviously transcription software is mature. We have good, clean transcripts. And what we've done now is we've integrated that into Slack, and we have an AI system that can read it. And so once a new interview drops, we can use an AI system to quickly summarize it. It can call out specific things. We've set it up so it can call out things that we are particularly interested in. And then we can query the interview directly through Slack. We can say, in the interview with, whoever it is, Jamie Dimon, did he say anything about this? And it will go hunt, it will find, and it will give us a link into the transcript so we can check it. The other thing it can do is you can obviously use this to query multiple interviews. So you can say, the last 5 panels, what did they say about modular nuclear power? And you can say, well, 3 of them talked about it, and this is what they said. And so it's a way of extending our brain power and our reach. And then the thing we want to build after we get this, sort of completely prototyped and out the door, we're running another test on it today, is I want to build a system where reporters can put in things that they are specifically interested in and have essentially an agent run across the entire corpus of the interviews. And if it finds what you're interested in, it will tell you. So you don't have to ask the question. So, let's say, for example, you're an energy reporter and you really care about modular nuclear power. But you don't want to sit there every day typing in, did anybody across Semafor interview someone who, talked about modular nuclear? We'll just build a bot for you that will roam it. And whenever somebody says something about modular nuclear 2 weeks from now, you'll get a Slack message.
Nice. So it sounds like you've got a really sort of AI forward attitude, and maybe that's advantaged somewhat by having a smaller newsroom. And I presume maybe some maybe skews younger newsroom. I don't know. You tell me. But I'm just more curious about the overall attitude toward AI, because there's certainly on various places and just sort of broadly in the industry, there's been clear skepticism of it, both from is it the flaws with the technology, like hallucinations, the sort of looming existential threat of replacing us, so to speak, or at least replacing big parts of creative work and journalistic work. As well as good concerns around copyright and what AI fundamentally does. How have you dealt with that? It sounds like you've kind of gotten past it, and like how is that sort of general attitude around AI changing, and how are you shaping it with your newsroom?
Yeah, I mean, so in the newsroom, I would say, we don't see those attitudes by and large. And I think that it stems from a couple of things. I mean, one, obviously, it stems from the fact that we are relatively small and a tight-knit organization. We're relatively young, both as a company and in terms of the staff. And I think that sort of that speaks to a sort of a slightly different attitude towards this. And obviously, we're growing and we're building, and so we want to extend our reach as much as we can with as much help as we can get from systems. I think what you've raised, I think, sort of touches on a couple of different ideas and topics, which I think the industry is trying to grapple with, less so us. So the first one is the question of hallucination and accuracy. And I think if you understand at heart what large language models are, and obviously there's other bits of generative AI that we're talking about, but in our particular case, because we're not doing audio generation or video generation so much, we're really talking about LLMs. And if we understand what LLMs do, and LLMs are large language models, not large fact models, and if you don't depend on them for facts, but you depend on them for their language handling capabilities, then you're in much better shape. And so we're not saying to an LLM, tell me what happened in the State of the Union last night. What we're saying is, here's the text of the State of the Union. That's not actually what we're doing, but in theory, here's the text of the State of the Union. Tell me what was said. Tell me, how many times this was said. Tell me, how this relates to some other speech, say, that the president has given in the past, right? Those are language handling capabilities. And as long as you keep the corpus of it relatively tight, it actually does a really good job of that. I personally use Claude, as a sort of a writing companion assistant when I'm writing on my own stuff. And I find it to be astonishingly good editor. I mean, I've said this in public multiple times. I'm sure at some point someone will get really angry, but it is a better editing companion than I'd say 60% of the human editors I've worked with. And I've worked with some really, really good human editors. So from a purely language capability point of view, it's really good. And that's where I think if you understand that limitation, you understand that you're building around that limitation and not expecting to do other things, I think you cure some of the other issues that, and not depend on it for things it can't do very well. Yeah, clearly there are copyright issues and so on. There are ways around some of those issues, and you can work on different models. But clearly, that is a much bigger and broader question. I think not just for the industry to resolve, but for society at large to resolve about what is acceptable copyright in this world. And then I think the existential threat question is sort of the flip side, right? Which is, will they replace us? Will they replace large parts of what we do? Will they take away some of my meaning and my identity? I mean, there was this piece you may have seen recently about the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and
Yes.
the fact that that they have an AI rewrite desk, and the question then is, what is a journalist if they can't write? And I think that is, and this is not a Semafor issue because we have again, I said a different strategy. I think the question for the industry more broadly is, what is our mission? Is our mission to write stories, or is our mission to inform the public?
Right.
And I think depending on how you answer that question, you come to a different conclusion about where and when AI is appropriate to use. Again, leaving aside some of the technical issues and leaving aside some of the copyright issues, environmental issues, but if we just accept it as a technology, then where do we sit in all of this? And then I think there's a much bigger and broader existential question, which we as an industry, again, are only starting to grapple with, which is, it's not about us. How is it affecting how people come to information? How is AI changing their approach to how they discover, how they consume, how they expect information to come to them? And my contention is that's going to happen with or without us. And how do we adapt to that world?
Lot to unpack there, and I agree with virtually all of it. I have to say, I think to sort of mine at least one sort of, I would love to mine a lot out of what you just described on across all those dimensions. But um, when you were talking about the Cleveland Plain Dealer and what they were doing, which is they have an AI rewrite desk, and we can talk about like the atoms of journalism, right? Which is like the journalists will give their notes and quotes and et cetera, interviews they given, and then the AI writes the story. But given what you said earlier about the notables, and it sounded like that having AI copy published might be a red line for Semafor, right? So is that a red line in the AI policy that you have, or is it?
So I wouldn't put it quite that way. What I would say is that nothing should get published at Semafor that isn't reviewed by a human, right? How that copy is actually, I mean, as a practical matter, we don't actually have any AI generated copy, but but my line isn't, it was generated by AI, so you have to rewrite it before you can publish it, which seems like a slightly pointless exercise. My line is, if it's published, I need a human to have seen it and take responsibility for it. As long as that has happened, I think it's fine. It's, to me, it's the functional equivalent. Did I use Excel to add the numbers that are going to go into the story?
Right.
And, is that Excel generated, or is that humans? Like, at the end of the day, I publish it. If there's an error, I get sued. And so I've taken responsibility, and it's exactly the same thing. If the AI system writes something that's grossly inaccurate and I'm fool enough to publish it, that's my fault. It's not the AI system's fault.
Agreed. And I think that fundamental of like governance and where the buck stops is I think a key part of any AI policy.
Can I just just complicate this for a second? And again,
Please.
this is not a
I was going to do it, so you go ahead.
but just as a slight matter of complication, right? So I used to run the graphics team at Reuters. It's a great graphics team. They do, and and graphics isn't just like your little chart. Graphics is deep, immersive, huge database structures. I built this thing, or I oversaw this thing called Connected China, which is, I would say, one of the most beautiful things ever done that showed how power flows through China. And you can explore that, and you can see how this person was connected to that person. It was built off a database of relationships. So-and-so was the principal private secretary of this person. They went to school together, all of that, right? All of that information is verified, but we could not possibly go through and look at every possible permutation of a user coming and exploring it. Is that acceptable, or is it not acceptable? I thought it was acceptable because we had done every possible search, every possible grounding and verification as we get. But when you think about large immersive graphics that newsrooms, from the New York Times to the BBC to Reuters build, they don't go and have a human check every possible public-facing output that it has. And my answer to that is like, I think if you build the correct systems in place, that's acceptable. That's not what Semafor does, and it's unlikely to be something that we do in the near future. But nonetheless, I just want to make clear that there are shades of the question of a human will look at everything. Because in fact, we may get to a point, as we already have with graphics, that that we have other ways of determining that we have confidence in the output.
Mm. And I think, to your point, I think that the confidence in the output and then communicating that to both like internally and externally, I think is kind of the where things get a little weird. Like first, just quick step back when you made the Excel comparison. Again, I agree with you, but someone might counter argue like, well, Excel is deterministic software and AI is probabilistic software. So it's a little apples and oranges. That said, I also think what you said about like language models versus fact models is a great. I think I'm going to steal that and start using that because that's a really smart framing, particularly for framing training journalists. Right, that's a great internal line. And I guess I would think about like my question would be about sort of the education component, not just of the journalist side, but like the audience side. And I feel like the default thing is the disclosure, that you see at the bottom of every chat GPT window. This can make mistakes. And that seems to be good enough for AI models and maybe their users. And this is, I feel like, the fundamental tension in the media and journalism where it's like, well, wait a minute, that's never really been quite good enough for us. So how do we scale this technology? And it becomes that I feel like that's kind of like the case by case thing you kind of have to just kind of figure out as we go.
I think that's right. I mean, again, every news organization is going to have a different line where they feel they can cross or can't cross. And so in this regard, I'm not really talking for Semafor because again, I think our
No, I hear
rule
you.
is going to be, a human looks at it before it goes out. But I think part of the question there is really, how well can you constrain the error rate? And what is that error rate? And just to be provocative, what is that error rate compared to a human error rate? The argument being if it's less than a human, well, okay, we're kind of ahead of the game. Are self-driving cars safer than human cars? I mean, the statistics show, I think that they are not that I'm
I'm
particularly
glad you brought
always
that up
comfortable.
too, because again, like I can't disagree. I don't. I also sort of understand the other perspective. I guess
No.
maybe this is my journal where I'm sort of like, well, like when a self-driving car and by comparison, an AI system makes an error, it's kind of in a different category, if you know what I
Yes.
mean. Because
No,
I
no,
completely agree with you
it's
that the error rate's
that
lower, but can be
there's
lower.
a
But
whole set
yeah.
of accountability questions, moral questions. There's
Mm.
all sorts of things, and and a self-driving car, having to choose between running down the I don't know, you're running down the baby or running down the group of teenagers because there's no choice. I mean, like there's a human, and the human you can say like, what? Why did you do this and not that? And an AI system, first of all, if it's deterministic, that would be one thing, like who programmed this? And if it's probabilistic, it's like, what was going on here? And it's not always clear, right? So I think what I would say on that is, I'd say everyone's got a different line that they're prepared to draw in the sand, at least right now. And we're waiting a little bit to see how much better the systems get. But I do think there's certain things that AI systems can do that are actually pretty accurate right now, or at least about as accurate as a human. Which is say, if you want to do a quick summary of a relatively short piece, it's actually pretty good. If
Right,
you
for
want to
sure.
stitch together a couple of documents and draw, if you like, conclusions out of all of them as a whole, it's not bad. It's when it gets to be a larger corpus where hallucination kicks in a bit more. And so part of this is kind of what is so some of it is kind of where is our comfort level, and the other part is how can we engineer our way around some of these answers. But then I think there's another side to this, because I completely understand, and I'm 100% on the fact that we should not be putting out anything that we know knowingly is false, and we should not be enabling systems that have a high probability or even a medium probability of putting out things that are inaccurate. We do also have to figure out how we deal with that with the public, because increasingly the public is going to come to accept certain levels of, frankly, of error.
Right. I call it the fuzziness. The
Yes.
society is sort of just having to deal with this AI fuzziness. I mean, AI adoption is just it's increasing. It's getting,
Well,
hundreds of millions of people, and people are kind of getting used to systems telling them
things that
weirdness
are
in
slightly
some contexts.
right, more or less
Yeah.
accurate, but maybe not completely
Right.
accurate, but truthiness, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Exactly.
the Reuters Institute had a statistic, came out recently, right? I think 3% of 18 to 24-year-olds use chatbots as a main source of news, which, if you think about that, is slightly terrifying. And you think of it a slightly different way. It's like 3%. Okay, not so bad. But then if you go back 10 years, I think it was something like 4% of adults used social media as a main source of news in 2014 or 2015. And now it's like 30-something%. And so you can see how fast the adoption goes. And when you think about, I mean, we've told people for years, we've lectured people for years about, like, please don't trust everything you see on social media. And I'm not sure it has had much effect. And so if we are going to go into, well, I'm not saying it's a good world, but if we are going to go into a world where people increasingly expect information to be at their fingertips and to be tailored to something that they care about, how do we play in that space? How do we as a industry fulfill the mission that we have, which is to provide the public with, with accurate, verified, fair, balanced information, in the public interest? I think that's a really big question that we have to grapple with. And that goes beyond what is my newsroom doing? And that goes beyond, can my newsroom survive in this landscape?
Well, it's a lot to contend with. I feel like that. I feel the need to kind of ground us again a little bit. So I want to play a little bit off what the stuff you were just describing there. Like, absolutely the user preference. They're coming and they're kind of expecting, hey, could I get this as a podcast? Could I get this as a video? Could I, whatever. And the AI can do that. You can kind of remix and reversion content. And I'm not sure if Semafor is doing any of that, but I'm curious if you are interested in that as kind of a new kind of news product. This almost like used to call it sort of the notebook LMification of everything. I don't think it's happened a whole lot, but I do think there's stuff to be mined there. Like, what do you think of that as kind of a product?
So I think there's two. I think from a newsroom strategy point of view, right? And again, two different hats, right? What's good for a particular newsroom and what's good for society at large are two very different things. They've always been two very different things, right? So Semafor, I think, plays in a space where we have, I think, very smart reporters. We break a lot of news. We have a lot of events and live journalism. And the idea there is that you want to see what a person has a view on. And that person can be Ben Smith, or it can be Liz Hoffman, or it could be, Fareed Zakaria, Ezra Klein, Joe Rogan, right? I mean, like those people, and that is a space to play in where AI can help you perhaps, distribute your voice further. It can maybe help you be more efficient so you can do more of this. But it's not a place where AI intermediates you, if you see what I mean.
Agreed. I definitely think like what you brought up there is like the voice, like it's you going for a specific person. That's what I would honestly call fairly resilient to AI. Like people want the real deal, even if AI is a means to find it.
But then the flip side of that, right, is, what happened at the school board yesterday? Or, tell me about the State of the Union. Now, I might want somebody's smart take on the State of the Union, or I might just want to know what the president said. And so I think part of that is thinking through what is news and what is valuable to an individual person. So if I'm the parent and somebody's just gone up and done a story about the school board or the Department of Education or whatever it is in my town, maybe I don't care about everything, all of that stuff as much as I care about, like, what will it do to the art class that my kid loves? And can I reform that story so that that part is more front and center for me? And obviously I can ask more if I want. I mean, so I think that's part of like, how do I make stories more relevant to people? As a industry, as a profession, we have tended to build stories in a one size fits all manner because, well, we had to. I mean, we were putting, ink on dead trees and throwing it on your driveway. I could not version it for you. And even then we did, right? We had the local editions, we had the early edition, we had the late edition. We tried to do as much versioning as we could, but we are obviously limited by the technology and the economics. Well, now we can version at a huge level of personalization. And is that what people are going to expect? Can we version not just in terms of like, I would prefer this as a podcast, but if I have my phone and you can detect on my phone how fast I'm moving and technically where I am, if I give that information to you, if you can detect that I'm running, maybe that becomes an audio alert, a short audio alert. If I'm driving, perhaps that's a slightly longer but still audio thing because you don't want me to crash my car. If I'm standing in line at a bank, maybe I can read all 1,200 words. So the question is, for the first time ever, we have a technology that allows for the creation of narrative. Maybe not the world's best prize-winning lyrical narrative, but it does create narrative. And I think it's a really interesting question for us as to how we use it and how we think about ourselves in this chain of value. Historically, journalists have asked questions, they have assembled facts or got them, however they got them. They've brought in context, they've brought in analysis, they've created a narrative, they've distributed it, and then they've engaged with their audience, right? And distribution sort of went away at some point because, well, the internet, social media, and so on. We've poured a lot of our identity into narration creation. And now we have a system that can do some of that for us. So where does that, who are we if that's not what we are, right? And my argument is we're the people that ask questions. We're the people that gather facts. We're the people that should, in theory, be engaging with our audiences and understanding what they really want. And that is a virtuous circle. And yes, we will create narrative, but we will also have machines that can help us create narrative. So I just sort of think we are at the verge or precipice, depending on how you want to think about it, of a really interesting age. Not necessarily terrible, not necessarily fantastic, but a bit of everything, as they always are, or as these moments always are.
So what are you seeing in terms of what people want? Like, how are you seeing, like, what's successful for you in terms of AI? And how are you measuring that? Number one, for audiences. I'd be curious about internally as well. But what's working,
So I stick with Semafor for a moment, right? I mean, in terms of what's working is, sort of the tools, the efficiency, as I said earlier, there's efficiency tools. And then I think there's scaling tools. Scaling tools allow us to do more of what we could do if only we had time. So, Notebook LLM is a scaling tool, right? And so reading all of these transcripts is a scaling tool because sure, I could sit down all night and read all the transcripts, but why don't I have a machine help me do it, right? So that's a scaling tool. Then I think there's conceptual tools, which we're also building. Conceptual tools are tools that are things that in theory somebody could do if you had an army of interns, but as a practical matter, we've never had an army of interns, so we don't do that. And the simple examples are the ones where, it will go hunt down modular nuclear for me and tell me what happens. We have, a news budget that comes out, and, at every newsroom I've worked at, no one has ever read the newsroom budget because nobody wants to. It's, pages and pages and pages of what some other section is doing, and really you don't care. But of course you have to read it because the other section could be doing a story about something that you care about and you want to use it, or you want to, help them, or you want to wave them off a story that you're working on. So we built avatars that do that for us. So your responsibility is to put your thing into the news budget. It's a document. I don't know if anybody actually reads it, but we have avatars, agents that read it. And then they tell you, like, hey, the business desk is working on something you might be interested in. That's what I mean by a conceptual tool. You can set things off to do things. And we're building out other similar tools. For example, we are building, and sort of, I hate to say this here, but we're building tools that will will either listen to podcasts or take podcast transcripts and, essentially look for things that we care about in the podcast. And so when I have a tool that will do that, and I'll be, hey, this podcast is about journalism AI. I'm interested in that. Tell me what it says. Give me the transcript. Maybe I'll listen to it, or maybe I'll listen to parts of it. At CUNY, we've built a newsletter of newsletters. So we subscribe to every newsletter that has the slightest relationship to journalism and AI. It reads those newsletters. It hunts for the things that we specifically are interested in. It gives us a summary newsletter of what's going on with clickable links to each of those newsletters. And more interestingly, which goes back to the sort of the conceptual army of interns metaphor, is it can tell me what the trends are. It can say, this week across the 50 newsletters that you subscribe to, the trend is about AI doing this or doing that, which, again, it's possible to do as a human, but it's kind of difficult. So from a Semafor point of view, I think that's great. And we are learning to extend our reach for a small newsroom in a very effective way at a relatively, low resource, low cost manner. In terms of, what have I seen of audiences? And again, Semafor doesn't play quite in that space, right? We're, again, high voice organization with people that really kind of want to come to us.
They're
Is
not
it
going
happening?
for the scale per se, I guess.
Yes. But
Yeah.
is it happening elsewhere? Are people turning to AI intermediated outputs? And I think the jury is out on that, right? I mean, I think it's not quite an article of faith for me, but it's sort of an understanding that I can see the trend lines and that they were very early in this, but I think it will accelerate. And that 3% statistic from the Reuters Institute is a really interesting one, because I think we're starting to see people come to us.
Just for clarity, can you just explain the statistic real quick for?
Sure, it's 3%. It's 3% of 18 to 24-year-olds say they use chatbots as their main source of news,
yes,
right?
okay.
And so that's an interesting statistic. And so, and I think that fundamentally understates the actual use of AI systems and information. Because, if you do a Google search now, you'll get a summary, right? And that summary is AI generated. My newsletter of newsletters is AI generated. But if you ask me, do I use chatbots as a main source of news? I say, no, I don't, right? But am I using AI as a form of getting news? The answer is yes. So I think the world is going to change. And I think, again, that, we need to be on top of it. If we want that world to have more journalism at its center, to have more public interest at its center, we have to engage in that discussion. And I think time's running on that one.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Google, because then that, the big picture idea of people are finding out information through these AI portals, whether it's an AI overview or a chatbot or something else, it's just a reality. And so the whole, I guess, I don't know if it's a debate even, but it's it might even be misconception. I'd love to hear how you see it and if there are misconceptions with it. But the idea of these engines scrape content and then summarize and then don't give you traffic, there is a default and justified view that that's stealing and we should block them. And at the same time, the industry has to contend with the reality that this is how people are finding information now. Those are kind of, again, the tension is obvious. But how as a media organization do you contend with that? You want your narratives to be found, but you also don't want to give your copy away for free. Are either of those flawed? And how do you balance it? I don't know.
A lot of this, I think, is going to wind up, revolving around what is the definition of copyright and fair use in this world, because copyright law, honestly, is just not built for this, for this reality. And at some point, that's going to get adjudicated. I have no idea when, and it might take a long time. And frankly, the world may well have moved on and we would be, de facto in some other structure already or whatever. We'll all be out of business. So it's an interesting place to be.
But do you think fundamentally, is there a compensation at that level? Is that merited, or is there's a view, I guess, that I again, I see it but I'll just articulate it for you. With that, an AI engine summarizing is, in a sense, qualifying the audience before it gets to you. Again, in a sense, and I know there's different stats on
Yes.
different content and everything. So even like, because you could always say, oh yeah, we should just do pay per crawl, or we should just do licensing deals, or do a mix, or whatever, and hopefully that does get adjudicated. And I certainly not making some contention that revenue should go away or isn't justified. But what I am saying is, like, are there other ways to think about this, particularly for smaller newsrooms that can't just call up OpenAI and get a deal? Like, how do you think about people coming in through the AI front door? And it comes down to the block or not, and how do you think
Yeah.
about who's coming through, and
So
how do you build a business on it, really?
yeah, so I'm going to give an answer that's really not designed as practical advice, but it's more as a sort of a theoretical framework on value and where it sits, right? And I think one of the core issues that we have is that a lot of information is somewhat commodified, and there's only going to be, and there's a very interesting paper. I forget who put it together. I think it's MIT put together a paper about, sort of the value of information in an AI age, and the fact that everyone has differential pricing because everyone has a different cost of creation. And so the problem is that keeps driving the price lower and lower because we're all in competition to essentially tell you what the president said at State of the Nation, State of the Union. Yes, I mean, like it's impossible to say like you should pay me more than they should pay you because somehow my facts are better. I mean, it was on TV. You can't charge for it, right? And if frankly, if you couldn't, you could have just called up, the White House, and they would have given you the transcript too. So the question about what is the value of sort of raw content in a world like this, as a purely economic as opposed to a moral question, is a really tricky one, because you're sort of really saying like, how much of my information is truly unique that I can command a price for? And sure, if I have a great scoop, is that valuable? But also, once I've written my scoop, Francesco Marconi, who's the CEO of Applied XL, really smart guy, wrote this post on LinkedIn recently, which is like, take 0.2 seconds or whatever it was to take a scoop and just take that information and distribute it. Copyright law says, by the way, that you cannot copyright facts, only the form of words.
Yeah,
and
right.
So again, copyright law needs to evolve. But the point is, technically speaking, none of this is protectable. So what is protectable? What is your value? And I would actually argue that small newsrooms that serve very small communities or very specific, tightly knit communities actually have more protectable IP than large newsrooms, because by and large, those communities are not, you're not in competition to serve those communities with more with other people. So if I'm only covering one school district, who else is covering that school district at the depth that my little organization is? Can I protect that? And the answer is, possibly. But then I also think that the value is going to be, as I said in the front end, it's the gathering of facts, but it's the understanding of your community. And so if I serve 20,000 families in a school district, and I know that you have a kid who loves art, and that person has a kid who has a special needs thing, and this person really cares about the sports team and the coach. I can, in theory, in going out and reporting, take that information and make sure you have a story about the arts program, and they have a story about special needs, and they have a story about, about the sports program and the coach. It's a way of super serving people, and that the value is less in the facts that are collected, because anyone can frankly collect those facts, but it is in my understanding of my audience, and it's the super serving of them, and that's how I build loyalty, because they care about what it is I care about what they care about, and because of that, they are more bound to me, and they can't go to ChatGPT and say, what's going to happen to my son's, PE teacher?
And I think the newsrooms that do that well will cultivate that audience and be rewarded. And I think it's great. It's funny. I think we've come to this. You've echoed a conclusion that I sort of have articulated at various times, and it does have caveats on like making sure that AI is optimized for the right things. But it is that like it alters incentives that could actually improve journalism in
Yes.
in many ways, because you have to find that uniqueness, that community, and be able to connect with them in such a way that is the value.
No, no,
Um,
absolutely. Let me give you an example from a long time ago, and no shade on the Washington Post, which is a lovely organization, and it's very sad what's happened to it. But, years ago, maybe 15, 20 years ago, there was an organization called Homicide Watch, DC.
okay.
So, at the time, there were about 110, 105 homicides every year in the DC area. And, you can guess how many of those the Washington Post actually covered, right? And it's like, again, no shade on them. It's, your limited resources, you do what you can do. And there's a definition of what is a newsworthy murder, right? It's the congressional aide, it's the gang killing, it's the person in the wrong neighborhood, all of that kind of stuff. So Homicide Watch, which was 1.5 people, Laura Amico and Chris Amico. Chris had a full-time job, so he was only doing it part-time. They decided they would cover every homicide in the city. And they covered it in a very simple way. They covered it as structured data. They covered it as who was killed, what's the victim, who is the, who's the suspect, who's the investigating officer, where was it, what time, what was the thing. They covered, what are the court dates. They took that, and because they had that data, which is sort of pre-LLM reformatting of data, they could turn it into stories with a little bit of human help. But and they could do things like in this corner is the deadliest corner in DC, or they could say murders have come down over the last 3 years, or murders of this kind have come down, and they found they got very solid. I think they got 500,000 page views a month of people who essentially were never served by the conventional idea of what is a newsworthy killing. And somebody decided that, in fact, they were important people and that their needs needed to be recognized. And so I just say, that is a case of super serving a very tight, specific audience. You can do it today. You didn't need generative AI to do this, but generative AI will let you do it, frankly, in a better and more interesting way.
Yeah, that's I'm just thinking that's so impressive they did that before AI, and now I couldn't even imagine doing it without it today. Um, Listen, as we wrap up here, this has been great. I always ask sort of the last question is always the same. Like, what's one thing that you're hopeful about with respect to AI and media, and what's one thing that might be keeping you up at night? So give me, and you can do that in whatever order you like.
Okay. Well, I mean, so I wrote a piece recently on my Substack. Please read, please subscribe.
Indeed.
Which is, there are people I think who sort of think about AI as this wondrous thing that will fix everything, and there's people that think like, hey, it's a bubble, it's going to go away, it's not a real thing, and we're just expecting this thing to collapse. And one of my and so fears on both sides, right, are that like we take one of these extreme views as opposed to kind of the middle thing. I think the thing that I hope for is that news organizations take a broader view of what their mission is, and that they're here to try and serve the public, not to try and keep writing stories that they would like to write or preserve just what we do, but more think about it from the sort of the broad mission point of view, because I think there's both threat and there's real opportunity for us to do a better job, as we discussed, and obviously real threat, right, to our business model, to the ability to keep the lights on, all of that kind of stuff. And then I think the thing that I fear is that we don't take this seriously, that we sort of say, well, no, people will always want our stuff, or, no, this will collapse of its own weight. We just have to kind of sit it out. Nobody wants this slop. It's all terrible, and so on. And I think the more dismissive we are, the more we cede the ability to try to influence the debate. And I think this is one of those moments in history where being involved and having a voice in trying to change the landscape for the better is really important. And I think it would be both a shame and, frankly, a disaster if we don't try to engage. So that's my fear.
Nice. We'll leave it there. Gina, Chua, thank you so much for coming by and discussing all this stuff with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with Gina Chua of Semafor. Media Copilot is a podcast, and it'd be fantastic if you could give the show a star rating if you're listening on Spotify, a like and a subscribe if you're on YouTube, and a review if you're on Apple. All those things really do help the show because it'll put our podcast in front of more people. The Media Copilot podcast is produced by Michelle Musso and Ryan Huntington of Musso Media. Look for their link in the show notes, and don't forget to subscribe to the Media Copilot newsletter as well. Thanks again, and be seeing you in the future.